All right, this is just a quick video to clear up a misunderstanding that is pretty common, and it has to do with a rule that's often stated. And I'm doing this video because I've thought about doing it before, but someone actually wrote me and asked about it. And their question was something along the lines of, I saw that there's this recommendation to grind your axe in a half moon shape. So it would be like, something like this, and so far back on the edge. This recommendation, which is seen in Mason's book, Woodsmanship, and An Axe to Grind, which is a pamphlet put out by the Forest Service, both of which you can read online for free, by the way, and I'll put links in the description. They both recommend this, and the Forest Service manual draws heavily on Mason's recommendations, up to the point of recommending this and also their template, his template for measuring what the curvature of the axe should be in this direction here. And this is the classic dummy rule phenomenon. A general guideline for a specific context that's stated as a dogma, more or less. It doesn't address what the actual goal is. Now, I'm not familiar with all the different configurations axes come in, but let's take a look at some of those. One is just a wedge. So this is flat, but when it came, I had to file it to refine it and get it really flat, but that was the original intention with this axe, and that's how it comes from the factory, is as a flat wedge this way and a flat wedge that way. As you can see, there's just a little bit of ground out here on there, but there's no intentional concavity from here to here. The common American axe is like this, where it curves in this direction, especially here, and it has a hollow here. So that's going to look like, if this is your axe eye, it's going to dip in a little here and then go to the edge or something like that. It's a terrible drawing, but there's a concavity in this area between the eye and the cheek over here. The cheek being this. Now, I'm not totally conversant with the terms that people use to talk about axes, but I just know what I'm talking about, so I might not use terms that people are familiar with. Okay, so another one, I have a good example. An example is the Grand Forest axes. They'll have a bit that's this one isn't flat from here to here, but it's relatively, but they'll be flat pretty much across the whole width here in this plane, which again, the American pattern is it curves like that. And then they'll have a hollow grind. So this is an old Craftsman axe that someone out of the factory, like after someone bought it, they took a grinder and ground a big hollow right in here. So in that case, this is relatively straight across in this direction. It's not very wide, and then it drops off into a hollow much quicker. And then I don't have an example, but the ox head axes of Germany are a good example of an axe that's basically just really thin. They're almost just like a slab. They're crazy thin way back in here, and they seem to be just sharpened pretty much on the edge. At least from the little bit I've seen. I've never owned one. I've just seen them in the store and pictures and stuff. So there's some different examples. Now, the only one that this rule applies to is these American axes that are ground in a convexity this way. And the recommendations on how far back this should be ground are based on whether or not and how much this has a hollow like this. And that's all. That's the only reason this is here. So let's take a look at the recommendation that you grind your axe to a half moon shape and apply it to these other types of axes. Well, if you applied it to this, it really wouldn't make any sense, because these, again, are just like a flat slab of steel with a sharpened edge, as far as I can tell. It wouldn't apply to this because there's no curvature here and there's no rise here. These already actually are relatively thin towards the edge. They have less of a cheek, and they just are basically sort of lacking this hollow and these hollows on the sides. So I could take this and I could turn it into this to an extent at least, are close by grinding out the sides. So this would get removed right here, and then I would grind a hollow back in here between about this point and that point or something like that. But I couldn't take this and apply it to that here because it's basically already there. If I were to say, oh, I read that I'm supposed to grind my axe in a half moon shape, and I were to take this axe and try to apply that, I'd have to grind like a divot, like a big divot right here to make it that shape, and that just makes no sense at all. And finally, if we were to apply that here, it also doesn't make sense. The hollow is much closer to the edge right here. It dips in sharply here. So again, to make that pattern, if we're arbitrarily looking at that pattern, which is what the rule says, it makes no sense because we'd have to, again, dive in here, make this really thin, grind this even thinner. Again, you'd be running into like having to hollow out a divot or grind out a hollow right here, and that's not the point at all. And typically, when you get these from the factory, they're super fat here, and then it's necessary to grind this in order to get the thing to chop because it's just too fat. If you look at this axe right here, hopefully you can see this, but just look how fat this is right in here. That axe is just not going to chop well. This is what you get from the factory. Like all the old dudes writing about axes will mention it, that, you know, an axe as it is from the factory is unsuitable for chopping and you need to, you know, grind it down, and they'll often mention this pattern. Well, that's interesting because while the wedge axe is an American pattern, as far as I can figure, that was once popular, at least regionally, the axes like this are so common that they can just make this blanket recommendation to grind your axe this way, and then they just leave it at that. Now, what they do supply in the Mason book is a template that looks something like this, which you're supposed to be able to, you know, cut out or whatever, a trace, and then measure what the author thinks the ideal configuration should be. So that makes up somewhat for the lack of understanding communicated by the, you know, the dummy rule that you should file your axe in a half moon shape. And you can find this in both of those books. This is a better thing to follow, though. I mean, there's no doubt that whatever those guys are recommending is going to, you know, function. And that's the important part. Does it function or not? And an axe like this from the factory does not function. So yes, you do need to thin it out. What happens is when you take a high centerline axe like this and you grind it back to the point where it actually chops, that's what you end up with, is this half moon. This one's not finished yet, but it's well started. And you can see it forms this. Now, to make a recommendation on how far this half moon shape should go back, did you hear that? That was a vole running by. That, again, is totally dependent on the axe. Like, how hollow is the axe in this area, and how far does that extend towards the edge, and how crowned is it? You know, I mean, just to say you should file a half moon into your axe and it should be this dimensions, you know, this deep and whatever, doesn't make sense. Also, there's just variability. You can see this is fairly uneven here. So here's an example of an axe that has that basic shape, and I filed it back not as far as common recommendation, probably because it just didn't need it because of how it was ground. Also, you'll note that it's uneven. Like I have this kind of a shape here. And that's because there was more thickness and material here. Like this part was ground out less. I can feel it. Like they just stopped grinding right about here at the heel. And then on this side, I took more out at the toe for the same reason. So I could file this, you know, out a little bit more to be more of the classic configuration. But my point is that it's not about the shape. Okay, the shape is only relevant to a particular context, which just happened to be really common. And if people give you this rule where they're like, hey, you know, just file it these dimensions in this shape and you're all good, well, that actually just isn't true. And it leads to some misunderstanding. Now, eventually you'll come to the conclusion that I just stated. But for people that are just starting out, reading these recommendations, looking at their axe and scratching their head, that's why I made this video. So with this axe, for instance, it's fat, and this has to come in. These cheeks have to be thinned out a little bit. And this has the classic shape. It's ground in here. It's got a bit of a hollow, though not a lot, right in here. Let me find a straight edge. This is a little bit straight. As you can see here, there is a gap that goes all the way from here to about here, but it isn't very much. If we take this, you can see that there's a lot more gap. So if I file this one back, it's going to go, you know, only so far back to get something that's going to work well. Whereas if I file this back, since there's less removed here, then this is going to come back further. That's okay in either case. It's just a matter of how the axe comes out of the factory. So while this general pattern of curvature this way with a hollow this way is common, very common in American axes, again, so ubiquitous and so common that people came up with this dummy rule that is supposed to just broadly apply to them. They aren't consistent at all. And the quality of one axe to another in terms of its finish, maybe this one would be left a little bit thicker here, and that's going to skew your pattern off this way. So I hope that clears up some confusion on that point. Enough for today. Thank you for watching.